Okay, well, no time like the present. Retooling and reframing for observability. So, we've been hearing a lot, and you'll be hearing a lot during the event about time series. One of the sort of overarching discussions in the industry right now is about this notion of observability. And so Influx was kind enough to ask me to come and kind of talk about some context. So we'll probably go up a couple of levels, a little bit more like 30,000 feet. Paul was good and down at the detail level, but stick with us. So here's the question that I think is sort of foundational to some of the thinking today about observability and what it means. And this is a big philosophical question, which is, do you ship code on a Friday afternoon? And, I think it's interesting because we've seen that as a question that is leading people in a couple of different ways. So you might have the traditionalist, which is the sort of look after yourself. Don't ship an application, don't ship a new service on a Friday afternoon, because if you do push to prod, then, what isn't it time to have some cocktails? Like, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if users aren't happy? What are we going to do about that? So there's a very strong sort of idea, and it's certainly for most enterprises. If you're a bank, it's pretty rare actually that a financial services organization, a traditional one at least, would be say, oh yeah, we're ready to ship an app on Friday afternoon. Frankly, for a lot of folks, that sounds like a bit of a nightmare. However, I think there is a sort of more modern view now taking hold in some organizations that are really, really confident in their software engineering discipline. And that's very much, if you're scared of pushing to production on a Friday, that's sort of a code smell. You've got issues with your processes. Are you doing enough testing? Because really you should be able and confident to ship an app at any time. Certainly, if we look at what we call the FANG companies, I put Microsoft here as well, because obviously their development velocity in a bunch of areas has increased. Certainly, they are an organization that we can learn from and respect in terms of their ability to ship product and deliver product. But I think basically, if we look at this, the Apples, look at all the incredible stuff that they released at WWDC, and a huge amount of very impressive software there. But certainly the worlds of Amazon, Netflix, and Google, those are organizations that we look to learn from in terms of software engineering discipline. Netflix in particular has got a sort of canonical view. Here was the organization that started this idea that it could push to production, not just once a month, not just once a day, but hundreds of times per day. And really, that's the sort of lessons that we're trying to learn. I'm Monk Chips, James Governor, one of the founders of a company called RedMonk. We spend a lot of our time really looking at software engineers, many of them in those leading organizations, certainly cloud companies, software companies, trying to understand what the elite are doing, trying to understand what the people that are living in the future are doing, and sort of package that up so that an enterprise or an organization that's perhaps a little bit more conservative can feel more confident and comfortable, but begin to emulate some of the approaches that those companies are taking. So, I think when we talk about the FANG companies, one of the ways I've really been looking at the industry and how it's changing is through the lens of product management, and product management from the sense of experimentation. We shouldn't be making decisions because, the highest paid person in the room says, this is the feature that users need. Or the highly paid salesperson comes in and says, oh, my customer absolutely needs this feature or they're not going to buy it. That's, really highly paid person, somebody coming in. We take a step back. A mature product management organization is testing. It's testing all the time. It's experimenting. It has a thesis, it tries it, and that's the approach that it takes in delivering product. And I think the modern sort of software development organizations are bringing those things together now. This culture of experimentation is really key and I think really critical. And it's not one that we've done historically, certainly in the enterprise. You can't experiment if it's going to take you 3 years to get the application built. Right? Experimentation, the culture of experimentation, is much more the sort of the world of extreme programming, the world of agile. You're doing short sprints, and you are data-driven. I think one of the things that's interesting to me when we looked at the world of waterfall is there's very much, oh no, the thing about agile is that there aren't enough metrics, there's not enough testing. Anyone that's doing modern software development knows that that is not the case. We are testing things, we are collecting data, and we are making better decisions because of it. So I think this becomes, you know, we used to have, you know, it's become part of the way we think about apps today. We think about Gmail back in the day, where you had Google Labs, Gmail Labs, and you could try things that not all users wanted, and they might not get rolled out as a service to everybody, but it was a sort of an experimentation approach. Now Google is doing that with Android. It's built in. So this notion of let's let some of the users have an experiment, have an experimental feature, see what they think, and then we'll roll that out more broadly. And really what we're beginning to see is a bit of a collision where some of those disciplines of sort of like content marketing, A/B testing and so on are coming to software delivery. And I think that's profound. And that's where observability begins to become extremely important. So do you test in production? You know, I think for the cautious people that don't want to ship on a Friday, they'd say, no, of course we don't ship in production. That sounds scary. Here be dragons. But really, I think organizations that are practicing modern software development, they know that in fact everybody is testing in production, because as soon as the code is shipped, it's in production, things will go wrong. In effect, we're all doing that. I think Charity Majors, again, talks about this really well. I mean, you know, historically, we had these, you know, this notion of different environments. Production environment is the only time you really know how the application is going to perform. There are so many variables that you're not necessarily in control of. You know, certainly you know, anybody that's been involved in software development at scale, yes, you've had those thundering herds, you've had those noisy neighbors, where something happened, there was a trigger in the system, something went wrong, perhaps you know, the messages started to back up and everything ended up falling over. This is a very, very common experience. And that's what I mean, that in effect, we are all, in fact, testing in production. Now, one of the things that we've been doing as an industry, in order that we can move faster, in order that we can experiment, is breaking things into smaller pieces. We've got the famous sort of Uber microservice graph, and trying to debug and troubleshoot in an environment where there are all of these distributed systems, and there's definitely a high degree sort of non-deterministic behavior here, is extremely challenging. If we're going to break everything down into these component parts, I think there's a joke in the industry, microservices kind of means breaking things down so that any debugging becomes, in fact, like a murder mystery. We need better tools so that we can understand not just what's happening in individual components, but in the interactions between those components. And that begins to push us towards observability, an idea that goes a bit beyond traditional monitoring. Some of this was all kicked off. 2013, we had Twitter came out and they wrote a famous post about what they were doing in observability. Because here again, an extremely complex microservice graph. You know, they had Zipkin to understand the traces of the behaviors in this system. And this blog, I think, really kicked off a lot of the debate about observability. But it was interesting because in some ways, it was somewhat of a traditional view of observability. And I think that you know, when we look at this, you know, this is one of the graphs. I don't know about you, and I'm sure there's somebody at Twitter that understands this time series. But to me, it just looks, it's pretty messy. Were they really able to home in to understand what was happening in the system? Because that's what we've got to do. And I think Twitter had this notion of 3 pillars of observability. So you were bringing together these hitherto separate disciplines of distributed tracing, of monitoring, and of logging, bringing them together so that you could do this much more effective troubleshooting across this extremely complicated service graph. But is that really observability? Just thinking that we can pull these 3 things together, maybe we can put all of our logs, all of our traces, all of our metrics into one database, and suddenly we're going to have observability? Or is observability a bit more of a culture shift? I mean, I think that some of the stuff that Paul talked about was very interesting to me, because we've got these different dimensions of time. Historically, logs were, of course, after the fact. You know, perhaps they were used for compliance. It was something that we felt that could be a little bit more cold storage and there are all sorts of cost implications. That's become in recent years a bit less the case. Splunk and others like it, we look what we're doing with the Elk stack. We want it to be a bit more real time in our use of logs. I mean, good example, say security incident management. You want to know in the last half an hour that a user has tried to log on 500 times. You don't want to know that in 3 weeks. It might be used for telling the auditors what happened in 3 weeks, but really you want to catch the problem now. So these sort of different time dimensions, certainly tracing is all about what is happening in the system, how are these microservices interacting with each other, and can we understand that flow? Is it enough to just pull it all together, or is there a bit of a culture change? Do we need to think differently in order to do observability? And I would argue that we do. I think observability is a set of conversations. So there is a conversation between the user and the system. How's it feeling? A conversation between the user and the product owner. If something goes wrong, the user starts to generate demand in effect by saying, hang on a second, this is not working properly. There has to be a conversation between the product owner and engineering. How can we fix this system? Please, engineering, we need to get this working. It is a set of conversations, and there are different sorts of tools and all of that. I thought it was interesting, again, in Paul's keynote, he mentioned the integrations with PagerDuty. It may be that you find out that the system isn't working, not because of what was happening in your logs, but because PagerDuty is beginning to generate events because people are putting in trouble tickets. Observability to me, I think, and this is part of the culture change, it's a love letter to the future. Writing good logs, having good telemetry, that's something that actually is making your life better in future. This is for the people that will ship code on a Friday. So it's like the more comprehensive your logs are, the more thought you give to the sorts of logs that you generate, the more easy it is to debug a system. I mean, who hasn't written some code and then perhaps 9 months later, they're trying to remember, when there is a problem, oh my goodness, what was I doing it? So it's a love letter to your future self, but it's also a love letter to the teams and anyone else. Part of empathy in software development is thinking about those future people that will need to maintain the systems we built. Because really, observability is about building maintainable systems. Tag all the things, thinking about those tags. So if we think about the cardinality, again, thinking about where sort of influx is coming from, we need to be thinking intentionally about the tags in the systems that we build. How are we going to use them to understand the systems when something goes wrong, or when performance degrades, or when users are telling us, hey, we need some help here? Using outputs to understand their system behaviors. I've said that systems that we're building today are non-deterministic. And I think there's a question of behaviors, output behaviors, to really understand what's going on is interesting, because that is not what we were doing. We're certainly monitoring in monoliths. It is a different way of thinking. Because there are unknowns. There's you, there's your system, and there are always unknowns. Things are going to happen that you didn't expect. So you need to be able to query that system. You need to be able to get insights that you didn't know that you were going to be looking for before. So yes, you want the tags. Yes, you want as much information as you can do in terms of really understanding, like, what are those going to be? What's the key? Is it user ID that you want to base everything around? Can we correlate that with some particular traffic? It's really thinking about that, because there will be unknowns. The more that we have the known knowns, the more that we're able to start using a system and thinking about identifying new sources of trouble. We think about sort of the Internet of Things. I think there's some really interesting characteristics here, because the Internet of Things is really, it's a network of black boxes. It takes that sort of microservice view and puts it on steroids, where you really don't necessarily know what's happening inside the system. You need a different way of looking at things. I've got some friends at a company called HiveMQ, and I thought they had a really good example of this. So they had a customer that is basically a car sharing application in Germany. And for them, observability was, what happened was, the system seemed like it was performing okay as far as the car sharing app people were concerned. But suddenly there were a lot of inbound phone calls from people in Berlin. It was 8 a.m. They wanted to get hold of a car, and they were like, wait, this is not working. The car sharing app, they weren't able to identify the problem. They called up HiveMQ, which looked at its message queues, and they were able to understand that, in fact, what was happening was the cell phone or wireless network was down. So it was a user that generated the realization that something was wrong. And then it was an entirely different set of systems that was actually able to identify that it was a network problem. So it wasn't T-Mobile that came and said, oh no, there's a problem with the network. That insight came from somewhere else. And I think that's a really interesting and good example of observability. And also I think it's important to understand that not all customers are created equal. So if you've got, I mean, here's the thing. With observability, it doesn't matter, you know, what you think is happening in the system. You can have 5 nines reliability. What matters is how the user feels about the system. If the user isn't happy, that's a problem, particularly if they're one of your premium customers. Are we able to start, as I say, perhaps tagging the user IDs of the customers that are most valuable to us so that we can really begin to understand their problem rather than the problem that everyone is having? It would be great to think, oh, we're going to solve everybody's problems at the same time. But actually, it may be that you want to solve the problems of your key customers as an absolutely, as a first priority, some triage there. And you've got to be able to query the system without bringing it down. This is not something we can do after the fact. This isn't 3 weeks later with logs. This is something that we need to be able to fix the system because it is a system in production. You've got users using it. So being able to understand what's going on, it might be through a streaming mechanism, that is absolutely key. And that's not historically how we've been thinking about troubleshooting. Talking about troubleshooting, obviously as an industry, we've moved much more to testing first. Oh, this is software as a manufacturing process. It's very smooth. Everything is going fine. We've done all the testing up front. All of the ice creams are looking absolutely beautiful. It turns out that quite often when we ship software, it's a bit more like this. Suddenly, there's a memory leak. We don't know what's going on. We're trying to get hold of that system. We're trying to identify what went wrong. It doesn't matter how much testing you do. We're still, in effect, shifting testing right, not just left, in this era of cloud deployments. And I think there's an interesting question here in terms of testing and observability, which is we've tended to really focus on velocity as the key thing. Oh, move faster. We've got to move faster, more features to more users. But really, quality remains extremely important. Some geographies in particular, I mentioned Germany, you look at what happens in Japan. Quality is the key metric. That's why you do the testing. Debugging production is scary. It does sound like, I think for a lot of enterprises, it sounds a bit like this. Even worse, it sounds a bit like this. This idea that we're rolling something out that isn't perfect. What if everything goes wrong? What if everything falls over? And we've certainly seen a bit of a culture shift in this area where sometimes failure isn't really failure. Perhaps you've had so many users that like the new service that it did go down. Maybe that's something that you can remediate after the fact. Stuff happens. Microsoft Azure, I was talking to a guy called Sam Guckenheimer, and he was talking about what Microsoft does in rolling out new features is progressive experimentation. Managing the blast radius. Perhaps you want to roll out a new service to your internal users first, or you're going to roll it out in Australia first before rolling it out more broadly. But you need to be able to observe these systems within those segmented user populations. Observability becomes very, very valuable in this respect. Launch Darkly talks about feature flags, fancy if-then statements. User comes in, they might have 1 or 2 different experiences, so that you can begin to understand the performance of that application for that user in production before you roll it out to everybody else. And software deployment, with that in mind, is no longer software release. Release is something that the product owner should do. The software developer can deploy, but that's not the same as releasing it to everybody. So I call this progressive delivery from that progressive experimentation notion. So progressive delivery is now a term that a lot of companies have taken up. It was interesting. RedMonk, we don't normally make up terminology, but this one sort of struck a chord. It's not replacing CI/CD. It builds on it. It has a set of disciplines that we see from those cloud leaders, and they are doing observability and testing these features before they roll them out broadly. They are doing what is called canarying. So perhaps take 1% of the traffic and give it the new experience before you roll it out more broadly. That might be from a do they like it or does it break perspective. Blue-green deployments, move your traffic over gradually until you're ready to move to the new thing. This basket of different technologies is progressive delivery. We see Amazon does this. they never roll out a service across the network because their need for isolation within regions and so on are so crucial. Amazon takes the idea they can never have a wildfire across their systems. Organizations like Nike are doing these sorts of approaches where, you know, they're doing feature flags. They built their own library for this called Mirai. And again, from a Nike perspective, the experience has to be perfect for the user, and they are very, very careful about testing everything in production with observability approaches before they roll it out across their entire e-commerce infrastructure. I think Cloudflare is interesting. If you've been in the world of microservices and cloud native, you've heard about cattle versus pets. At Cloudflare, they have dogs, pigs, and canaries. So at any given time, they'll roll out a new feature to a city, say Chicago, might be London or Berlin. That's the canary city. Dogs, loyal customers, don't mess with them, don't roll out the janky stuff. Pigs, people that use stolen credit card information to buy their services, use them, observe them, watch them, let them have all the broken stuff. They'll still complain about it, but that doesn't matter. They're not the customers that matter. And I think that notion of observability and understanding which are your key customers is really key to this revolution. Now, I thought another thing that was interesting about Paul's talk was this cloud native stack, because we're in a world where they're great. Okay, enterprises do feel comfort factors in adopting technology that's gone through the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. But it is an extremely complicated environment. We don't always know what's going to win. Some things sort of bubble up. I mean, we can rest assured that Kubernetes is a distro that we can run on. But, you know, we really want somebody, you know, people don't want to be putting this stuff together themselves. Obviously, perhaps if you're, you know, Silicon Valley company with some of the most highly paid engineers on the planet, you're investing heavily in them, sure. But for humans, you want someone to package up and bring that stuff together for you. And I think certainly the integrations with and the acceptance of and embrace of Grafana and Prometheus is an interesting take by Influx in terms of where they're going in that observability story. So at the end of the day, it's about developer and operator experience. This stuff is complicated. The stack is made up of all of these different components, different services from different places, open source componentry. That's a challenge. And really, you don't want it to be your job to pull all of this together. You want to outsource that to a third-party provider. And I think that's really key. Observability is something that you don't want to be building your own observability system. It's something that you want to be working with a user that with an organization that's going to build it for you. And you then just have to deal with the culture change. So it's finally, I think, just closing the loop on observability. It is about that sort of experimentation, being able to experiment in production environments before you roll it out more broadly. Because that Friday, the reason that you're comfortable to ship code on a Friday is that you've already tested it in production. You've observed the system, you've made fixes, and you know if something does go wrong, you've got systems in place that you're going to be able to remediate any further challenges. It's that set of conversations, listening to the user, pulling in that data. It's about bringing all of those different constituencies together. And I think observability, to me at least, is a much more powerful framework for understanding modern software delivery and modern product management, because it does have that notion of bringing in all of the different constituencies and understanding it is the system performance that matters. It's not something like something broke, let's ask the monitoring team what's going on. So that's sort of key, I think, to the culture change. And finally, it is that notion that the only thing that matters, the reason you do observability is what really matters is the user experience. Thanks.
Oh, wow, that was very quick. Okay, so if anybody has any questions for James, please put it in the Slack channel, the speaker Slack channel, or of course, if it's easier for you, put it in the Q&A or the chat panel. Before we ask James questions, he has questions for everybody. So everybody ready? So the first question that James has is, in what year did James co-found RedMonk with his friend Stephen O'Grady? That's question number one. Number two, what was James' career before becoming a principal analyst at RedMonk? And number 3, according to James, who are the real key influencers in tech? So those are our 3 questions. And so pop them into the Slack channel, and we'll see if you guys can get those answered correctly. So let me just go back and see what questions that we have. You know, I have to say that I'm looking through the entire chat, the Slack chat panel. I think a lot of developers were in agreement with you. There was some jokes about deploying on a Friday. And you know, I think there was a lot of the stuff that you were saying was definitely resonating with everybody. And I'm just gonna kind of share some of the comments that some people have made as you were talking. So Rick Spencer, actually from InfluxData, said that, hey, we ship on Fridays at InfluxData, but not most developers don't ship on Friday afternoon. We do continuous delivery. I think we ship about 5-ish times a day on average. Let's see. I think Ignacio had a cute comment. Read only Friday. I think that's the 11th commandment. Solomon says, what did he say? Testing in production. And Rick responded, testing in production is also developing in production. So I think definitely a lot of resonation there. Also, Solomon also mentioned that he's implemented hidden features to test how it behaves in production environments. So this whole thing just really resonates with him quite a bit. Let's see if there aren't.
We've got one in the Q&A.
Here we go. All right. So Hem asks, what in your opinion, are the best tools to use in order to get more information, data about user errors, warnings before them having to directly message you, the support team, intercom, etc. In particular, on a more cloud native stack.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So here, it's actually in the Q&A. Might be easier for you to read.
Okay. Where are we at?
Do you see it?
No, I don't. I mean, I would just say, I mean, I think the truth is some of this depends on your stack. You know, because there are, I think on the cloud native side, as I've said, we're beginning to get probably a better sense for what the expectations are. Again, I think in terms of managing the network performance, or rather understanding the container performance, that stack around Prometheus and Grafana is sort of emerging as somewhat of a standard. But if the question's in Slack, I can maybe answer it there, because I was looking.
Let me just post it in Slack to make it easy. Here we go. We'll just throw it in. There it is.
Is that in community, or?
I'm going to James. There we go. I just tagged you.
User errors, warnings before having them. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, I think that in a sense, a lot of these decisions have already been made, but definitely in terms of that sort of service management view. I mean, in the question you mentioned intercom, and they're just doing a tremendous job. I think making that sort of simplicity around multimodal. I don't know. I mean, historically, we've used that. The marketing people talk about 360-degree view of the customer. I don't think it's so much about a 360-degree view. What I like about what Intercom has done is they've just made it possible that there are so many different means with which the customer can raise an issue. And I think that, yeah, I mean, they've done an excellent job. Obviously, we've seen, I mentioned PagerDuty in the presentation. I don't think there are, I don't think there's any one tool in particular, but those two have definitely, I think, made the customer service experience a lot more compelling. And they've obviously got, from an ecosystem perspective, really good integrations with other third-party tools, so that when you've got that customer experience question, you can begin to integrate that with some of the observability tools that we've been mentioning.
Cool. Well, if there are any other questions for James, which I'm sure there are, just post them in the InfluxDays-speaker chat, and he can get to them. But what I want to do is I want to go back to the questions that Paul and James asked, and share with everybody the answers, and then also pick out some of the community members who answered them correctly, so that we can get you a couple of t-shirts. So Paul's question, what was the year that of the first release of InfluxDB? And it was 2013. Name 3 languages officially supported by the client libraries for InfluxDB 2.0. Go, Java, and RxJava. And then number 3, what open source license did InfluxDB use? And it is MIT. And I know a bunch of people answered that correctly. And let's see. Where did it go? And so we have the lucky winners for that session is Jeremy, LG, Tristan Sue, and Alex Halen. So congrats, and we'll get those shirts out to you. And then for the questions that James asked, in what year did James co-found RedMonk? And that was 2002. And what was James's career before becoming a principal analyst? And he was a journalist. And then number 3, I think the answers that I see in the chat are hilarious. According to James, who are the real key influencers in tech? And his answer is actually developers, not the FANG that everybody keeps referring to. And let's just see who are our winners for that one. And the winners for this session are Michael Kokanek, I'm not very good at that, Gavin, Kylie, and we've got nobody for the third one, but what we'll do is we'll just pick somebody, we'll actually have James pick somebody randomly during the break and get those shirts out to everybody. All right, awesome. Well, we are going to go into a network break at this point.
So one thing I have realized is that I completely misread the question, by the way. Sure. I thought, for what, I mean, anyway, I can answer it in Slack, but I've just realized that I was answering, in fact, the wrong question. So
no, go for it.
Yeah, I'll answer something in Slack. Yeah, so I think the question was not so much about what are the best tools for getting the user feedback, so much as avoiding having to get that feedback. And so on that note, I mean, I think this progressive delivery notion that I've been talking about really points to some opportunities. So for example, feature flagging, now that's not a production so much as a development approach, but you've got Launch Darkly that I mentioned, Split.io is another company that's sort of productizing that, and it is this notion that, yeah, you want to, you know, before you roll out something really broadly and start to generate complaints or issues, that you have tested that feature. Obviously, I would say that, and it's interesting, I saw it was mentioned in the thread, load testing. You know, there's all, you know, a ton of load testing tools out there, but I think that remains, you know, certainly in terms of observability of a system and in terms of testing, one of the things that you should be doing, because performance, I think more than anything else, is one of the things that generates complaints from users. Obviously, you know, just the world of just good solid testing. So, you know, whether you're a bit more traditional and you're using Jenkins, or you're you know, using tools more like Circle CI, perhaps you're beginning to take advantage of things like GitHub Actions. I do think that those sort of, there is a question of, yeah, those core basics of testing, whether that be on the integration testing side, or performance, those I think continue to be some of the disciplines and tools that we should be using before, the best way to avoid unhappy users is with more testing with really extensive test suites, and getting that right.